we've come to an understanding between us, the United States and China, that we have to find a formula to work with each other. But we also have a fundamental difference about how we view other Asian countries. We view them as allies, they view them more as vassal states. Do you think we can work through this?
Well, first of all, one has to give credit to some of the Asian states who basically are maneuvering us into that situation so that we begin to favor them, not necessarily to the best of our interests. I would go a little more easily on making arms available to, let's say, India or Vietnam. What choice does it give the Chinese in that context? I don't know how things will evolve. Perhaps we'll all get more and more enmeshed in each other, and global stability will move forward, and the integration of these various players on the world scene will become closer. But it might be the opposite. We may get pushed into a situation in which it becomes convenient, to say the worst, for the Chinese to think of North Korea as a useful tool in scaring us, or perhaps in doing something terribly nasty, if not to us, then to some of our friends, leaving us with the option, painful option, of how to react. Or perhaps we will both insist on asserting rights which to each of us seem to be absolutely righteous, but denied by the other. I have in mind, for example, what the Chinese are doing with these sand dunes, etc., in the South China Sea. But we overlook the fact that we patrol the Chinese borders right next to the border, literally international borderline, by sea and by air. And we have been doing this ever since the mainland became communist and Formosa at the time became independent. I often ask my friends, including some in the government, what do you think would be our reaction if there were Chinese warships once a week or so steaming close to San Francisco, conducting an inspection? Or worse even still, if they decided to create something or other in the Caribbean Sea. We have to understand each other's feelings on these issues. And now I think we have gotten ourselves respectively into a jam in which our respective military services, particularly naval, see as being endowed, each of us being endowed with a special mission to control what they're doing, but not pay much attention to the consequences of what we are doing.
Are we drifting to a crisis?
We could be if that were to continue. If we were to get some leadership that likes to spout and show off and pound the table and make threats, which we haven't done yet. Although selling arms, let's say, just to approving the sale of arms just to India, but boycotting the Chinese is not a friendly act. But at least it's a tolerable act. It could get worse, yes, so you cannot exclude it. The Chinese themselves could become irrational. There have been phases in Chinese history of extremism, a kind of mobocracy, mobs dominating the scene. And that coincided with the birth of nationalism in China. So the Boxer Wars and everything else created a feeling that the outsiders are intruders and dominators. But that has receded a great deal. The Chinese are now more confident, full of pride, and justifiably so. So I'm not a pessimist, but I do worry occasionally that we have not asked ourselves often enough, which is what statesmen should ask themselves when dealing with others. How do my actions affect their actions?
During the president's trip through Asia, he went to Vietnam and announced that we would now sell weapon systems to Vietnam. What's your sense of that announcement?
I'm bothered by it because I think we're driving the Chinese into a box. We have already maintained successfully a wide-ranging embargo on any military sales to the Chinese. We're now going to provide arms to their former allies, now enemies. we are operating on the same basis vis-a-vis the Indians, who are of far greater significance to the Chinese, or a potential threat even. It almost looks as if we're trying to increase the threat to China, or to isolate the China, even with the threat of arms. I'm not sure that that is a good policy. The Chinese can be quite emotional, and they might ask themselves, well, what can we do to hurt the Americans? Who is here on the horizon who is a good candidate for sticking it to the Americans? Well, one little country comes to mind. In fact, it's a half a country. I think you know who I mean. And they happen to have certain kinds of weapons that others wouldn't like to see used. I think it's not the best way to manage a relationship, which is, of course, complicated. And the Chinese are used to being treated with respect, even if they're not at the top of the pile. And I certainly don't see them being at the top of the pile for some years to come. But in that triangular relationship, which I think is the way we'll have to operate anyway, we can't dictate to the world on our own, I think it's useful to have the Chinese, at least in some respect, on our side. So I hesitate. Also, quite frankly, these little sand islands with little airports on them, if they're so important, I would have American warships sail right by them, quite frequently and periodically. Let them see if they are prepared to fire the first shot. I don't think they would. But selling arms to the Vietnamese raises the question in my mind, what are we trying to tell the Chinese? That we are arming our new friends, who used to be their friends, in order to what? Have a better show if push comes to shove and they go to war against each other? I just don't see what we gain by it. I would prefer, and I think the international system would be better from our standpoint, if we and the Chinese were in a kind of semi-competitive, semi-accommodating relationship.